Hi folks, welcome back. In this short video we're going to be taking a look at some of the methods that people can employ for creating new woodlands. Tree planting is a very hot topic these days. It's taking place right across the world in many places for the right reasons, but it's not always carried out that successfully or effectively. So this is just going to be a very short overview of some of the methods people use, some of the advantages and disadvantages, and for those of us who love trees and woodlands, hopefully this will be of interest to you. So within a few acres of where I'm standing right now, I'll be able to show you at least 4 ways of how woodlands can start and how they can be supported by people or how they can do it naturally. So the section I'm standing in now is actually a clear-felled plantation. So it was a commercial spruce plantation and it was clear-felled about 7 years ago, I think. So the 4 examples we'll be able to talk through in this area is regen following clear-fell. There's commercial forestry, which is deliberate planting. We have creation of natural woodland through planting attempts, and then also just natural regeneration on an open expanse where trees have self-seeded. So this regeneration of the felled commercial forest is incredibly verdant and diverse. It's just amazing what has actually just sprung up naturally of its own accord. We've got willow, there's obviously spruce from the original mother crop, there's actually examples of larch, there's some oaks that have come out, mountain ash, and initially there was quite a strong cover of heather. So even the heather that would have existed here prior to the commercial planting sprung up, bilberries come up, and all this has come up naturally. So a real big advantage of this type of system is that there's very little work required, and what you have got now is a nice great base to do selective pruning or thinning. So you could come in here if you're trying to create a natural woodland again, which is a lot of the focus these days. You could come in and selectively take out a lot of the spruce and let the other native trees grow up as they are already. They're well established, they're obviously liking where they've seeded, and it's a great opportunity to just let them carry on and give them the space to grow. So I've just jumped across the fence that's dividing this commercial plantation from the regenerating clearfell. And the diversity over there, as we saw, was quite spectacular, and we'll see the difference in here now. So this plantation is the same age as the clearfell section we've just been looking at prior to the felling. And the difference between the diversity on that section and this side is actually quite stark. So particularly the forest floor, there's virtually nothing else growing on this floor. Compared to the other side, we had all the heathers, the bilberry, there were brambles, there were mosses, sphagnum mosses, all which naturally occur in this area. They had all regenerated. Under the conifer canopy, with the acidic needles, there's virtually nothing growing here. Another point as well is that these are all single age, so they're all the same size and have a uniform canopy cover. Now, for any kind of diversity, you want a real mix of species and age classes and types, and that creates the best habitat for all sorts of wildlife. Now, commercial forestry obviously is planted for one purpose. It's essentially farming trees for one product, and that's all you're going to get out of it. And that's felled after 50 or 60 years, and then you start the process again. So, it's a very long time to wait to obtain the value for one particular item. Now, it's obviously very successful in terms of establishing this particular forestry complex because they all survived, they all grew, and they've all able to provide a product. Now, if that's all you're looking for, that's no problem, and it can be done very successfully. These are quite hardy species and they survive up here on the uplands. But I think the general focus these days is looking towards more natural woodland and a more diverse landscape, and this format of forestry perhaps still has a place in some areas, but in many areas it's actually now seen as a bit outdated. So next we'll just jump over this fence and leave the commercial plantation, and we'll have a look at 2 examples literally in this next section of this upland heathland, and see where there have been attempts to plant native woodland from scratch, and also some examples of natural regeneration from naturally seeded native trees. So in this scenario, we have a tree planting activity or regime that was carried out about 2 years ago. It was conducted by a local government organization, and they had a fair bit of thought went into it, planning, They had the funding approved, obviously the plan of where they were going to plant was approved, but you could argue that it was spectacularly unsuccessful. Now there's probably a few reasons why this was so unsuccessful. Chiefly, I think, was they didn't actually enclose the planting zone correctly and didn't exclude, grazing animals. So that was probably the main problem. It is also quite an exposed site. It's an upland area, so I do wonder about the provenance of the trees that they sourced, the actual plants. Were they plants that could tolerate this kind of environment? I'm not sure. But this is an example of the kind of problems people face if they're trying to establish a new forest in an area that hasn't had trees for a long time. So this is an example of one of the trees that they attempted to plant. So it did have a stake, it did have a guard, but this tree is no longer protected by this guard. It's pretty ineffectual. The growing tip's been eaten by probably a sheep, and so this whole tree is now pretty much dead. So in this case, obviously the wind has had a severe impact on this tree. Its roots are totally exposed. This stake was very ineffectual. It's obviously been spiraling around in the hole and obviously snapped off at some point as well. So, this tree's got no hope. So if we just look down through this area where these trees were planted, and as I say, 2 years ago, and virtually every single tree is no longer viable. So this was a totally failed tree planting experiment. So I'm a bit further down the slope in that same section, and this is another tree. The guard's long since vanished. Growing bud has been eaten off, but this poor thing is actually bravely trying to grow again. Look, there's actually some life at the bottom there. How successful that'll be when it's surrounded by sheep, it's pretty much unknown, but I think it's a long shot. So here we have another example of a totally failed tree planting attempt, but right behind it there's actually example of natural regeneration, and there is a hawthorn. A little bit further along the slope you might just be able to make out a small holly, and then a bit further up the slope there's quite a few examples of spruce. Now these have all self-seeded, I guess in the case of the hawthorn probably with the aid of some birds, but they've all obviously established themselves naturally, and through that process are actually quite adapted to this particular environment. So here's a close-up of the holly I mentioned just now, and it's a very unfavorable place to grow. It's on the side of an old slate tip, which has slowly been colonized by heather and bilberry. But this holly, by establishing here, it's totally natural, and it stands a good chance of surviving. It's quite low to the ground, it's sheltered, but a much better way of regenerating woodland through natural means. So on the slope behind me now, there's another really good example of natural regeneration. So those light green trees that you can see coming through are mostly rowan or mountain ash, and they're growing up amongst the predominantly heather on that slope. Here's a good example of a naturally germinated rowan or mountain ash tree. So I know I mentioned in the beginning of this video that I was going to focus on 4 methods for creating woodlands, but there is actually a 5th method, and it's really a bit of a hybrid. So those of you who followed this channel or seen some of my other videos, you'll know we've actually introduced a coppice onto this land. Now when we started, it was heavily grazed moorland, upland area, and there was scrappy grass and some scattered rushes, and that's pretty much all there was here. So we took the decision to put some coppice in with the dual aim of creating a product, but also increasing the biodiversity of the area. So if we actually look at what's growing around us in this coppice, it's actually quite different to what we saw in the commercial spruce forest. So this is one of the coppiced willows that we coppiced a couple of years ago, and here's one of the trees that we actually coppiced a few months ago, and that's the fresh growth coming through. Now if you actually just look around this section, you can actually see quite a lot more going on the floor. So right where I'm sitting here, there's a thistle coming through. You have some sphagnum moss, got some marsh violet, bluebells. Here to my right, you've actually got an alder, and that's very good for nitrogen fixation as well. And then to the right of the alder, a fern too. So here's another example of one of the willows it's a year-old coppice. Behind it we have some naturally grown pillars of moss, in this case polytrichum, and you can see the flowers of the marsh violet coming through as well. Now we also took the decision in this coppice that we were going to leave some of these trees as standard, so we weren't going to coppice them, and the main reason for that is obviously to create structure, different age profiles, but also they form a great sort of substrate and habitat for things like the lichens. And you can see here we've already got 2 species, or at least 2 species, probably many more. I don't know lichens that well, but you know, it's another great reason to manage with more natural plants that then support all these other natural processes. Another great advantage of using naturally occurring trees or native trees is that they're so accustomed to this environment, and this goat willow behind me is a great example. They've absolutely flourished on this site. So you're starting off with a very high success rate. So hopefully that was of interest to those of you who love woodlands and love wood as a material. We all love to make spoons, we love to use our axes, but without the raw material we wouldn't be able to do any of that stuff. So creating woodlands is very important. I hope you found this enjoyable, and I'll see you next time.